Story 1. November 2nd, 1961. I've had the most unusual experience over the past 2 days, something which I am still processing. It's a strange thing, the Appalachian countryside, full of superstition and folk traditions. In the eyes of those who live there, witches still roam the hills and hollers looking for unsuspecting people to hex. Even still in this modern age of science, in some places of the world, magic is king. I recently came into possession of a cottage in West Virginia. Possession is a good word for it. I feel as though I need an exorcism after all that's happened over the last 2 days. My uncle had left it to me in his will, and I meant to go visit the place. But between work and everything, I didn't have time. My uncle was strange, but most of my family was strange. I'm the black sheep, you see. I turned out relatively normal and took up a career in journalism. I'm a man of facts, which is why I'm writing this journal, in the hope that whoever finds it will believe what's written herein. My brother Marty and my wife, Janet, drove out to Crooked Horn, West Virginia on October 30th. The leaves on the maples had turned to shades of yellow, red and orange that made the drive pleasant. The mountains stood glowering over the highway in what could almost be described as a threatening manner, if geologic formations could be considered threatening. The area roundabout was populated by agricultural land. Large harvesting machines were at work, bringing in the corn. Sheep, goats and cattle wandered the hill country, grazing peacefully. In fields, the ever-present scarecrow stood guard over the crops. I wouldn't find out until later how important those scarecrows were. "What a gorgeous place," said Janet. "We should have had our honeymoon here." "Had I known that, we could have saved a ton of money," I said. "Oh, stop it, Peter," said Janet, slapping my arm playfully. "Antigua ain't cheap," said Marty. I could see him grinning in the rearview mirror. As we approached the middle of town, the locals were busy. They seemed to be preparing for some festival. The next day being Halloween, I assumed it would be some masquerade party. I wasn't entirely wrong. At the edge of town stood a dilapidated country church, of the type one sees in little towns. In the middle of the village stood a pile of lumber and straw. Folks were still piling wood onto it. "Looks like a bonfire," said Janet. "We should go." "Seems like a good idea to me," said Marty. We stopped at a filling station and country store to fuel up. As we walked in the front door, the customers and staff seemed to eye us with suspicion. "Howdy," I said. "Afternoon," said the clerk. "What brings you to Crooked Horn?" "I inherited the McCormick cottage," I said. The man seemed to wilt like a head of lettuce. "I don't recall old Cyrus having any young uns," said a middle-aged woman nearby. She eyed me with an expression that sent a chill through my bones. She reminded me of a witch that one might find in a book of fairy tales. I would only find out later how right I was. "We're his nephews," said my brother. "I see," said the clerk. "We figured we'd at least come out and see what we'd inherited," I said. "You have a lovely town," said Janet. "We're looking forward to spending more time here." The clerk looked into her eyes and grinned. "Yes, ma'am," said the clerk. "Nice, quiet town." "I noticed they were building a bonfire," Janet continued, gesturing southward. "Are you having some sort of party?" "Yes, ma'am," said the clerk. "Have it every year on Halloween." "We'd be delighted to come," said Janet. "We'd be delighted to have you," said the woman. "We start about sundown, and we don't quit till midnight," said the clerk. "Sounds like a great time to me," I said. We bought some of the local produce and went back out to the car. As we were getting back in, I spied a scarecrow in the field across the road. I swore I saw him move. We arrived at the cottage as the sun was setting. I pulled into the short dirt road to the cottage, which lay nestled between 2 hills and was surrounded by trees. A stream ran alongside it. The caretaker, Howard, sat on a bench on the front porch, strumming an old guitar. He was a black man, tall and lean, his straw hat tilted to one side. He wore stained overalls, a flannel shirt and well-worn work boots. He lived in the shanty just down the road and cared for the cottage and the surrounding land when it was not in use. My uncle let him live there for free, and he had the run of the land to hunt and fish as much as he wanted. He smiled broadly as we exited the car. "You must be the McCormack boys," he said, shaking my hand. "I'm Peter, and this is Marty," I replied. "And this is my wife, Janet." "Howdy," said Howard, shaking hands with everyone. "I'll take your bags inside." We walked up the porch steps and entered the cottage. The walls were wood paneling, except on the wall of the fireplace, which was made of field stone. Taxidermied animals and antlers lined the walls, and an old grandfather clock stood in the corner. Rustic wood furniture was the only furnishing. I turned around to see an old horseshoe over the doorframe. I soon found that all 3 of the doorways of the house were adorned with horseshoes. Knowing my uncle's propensity for superstition, I wasn't surprised. The man always had a rabbit's foot in his pocket. "How charming," said Janet as she looked around the cottage. "Nice place," said Marty. "How's the hunting in these parts?" "Mr. Cyrus and I were usually successful," said Howard as he entered with the bags. "You packed quite a lot." "We're staying a week," I replied. "I wouldn't recommend that," replied Howard. "Why not?" "This ain't a good time for out-of-towners," he replied. "What do you mean?" asked Janet. "This time of year, with harvest and everything, it wouldn't be a good time for out-of-towners." "The locals seemed friendly enough," said Janet. "They seem that way," said Howard. He spoke no more on the subject, though I pressed him during supper. I woke up the next morning, October 31st, to a horrific scream. I leaped from the bed in the master bedroom and raced down the hall to where I found Janet standing outside, staring in shock into the bathroom. She was soaking wet and wearing nothing but a towel. Marty came bounding down the hall. I shielded Janet. Marty turned his back once he realized Janet was unclothed. "What happened?" I asked. "I saw someone looking in the window," she said, pointing at the bathroom window. The curtain was pulled across it. "Maybe it was an animal," offered Marty. "It was a person, I swear," said Janet emphatically. Marty went outside to look around while I helped Janet get dressed. "There was definitely someone at the window," said Marty when he returned. "Who would do that?" said Janet. "Spying on a lady while she's trying to take a bath. The nerve." I heard the front door creak and Howard's deep voice. "Breakfast," he said. "I hope I ain't too early." We all entered the dining area where Howard stood carrying a basket of eggs. "Fresh eggs," he said, bouncing his eyebrows. "Howard, you wouldn't happen to have seen anyone creeping around the cottage?" asked Marty. "No, sir," said Howard. "Why? Did you see someone creeping around?" "I did," said Janet. "There was someone at the window while I was trying to take a bath." Howard furrowed his brow and his lips lowered to a frown. His eyes widened in a sort of horrified expression which he was trying to hide. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Positive," said Marty. "I found tracks." "Folks around here tend to be curious of outsiders," replied Howard. "Oh, sure, very curious," said Janet. "Perverts." "You talk about the locals as if you're afraid of them," I said. "Is there something I need to know, Howard?" "Nothing you would believe." He left it at that. My reporter instincts told me to press him on it, but I didn't want to be rude to the man. I should have. I should have demanded answers. That afternoon, Marty and I decided to go out for a hike in the hills, while Janet went to town to do a little sightseeing and shopping. "Do you suppose Howard was the one spying on Janet?" I asked. "No," said Marty. "The tracks were the wrong size. Howard has big feet. Whoever was spying on you was smaller, lighter." I trusted Marty's tracking skills. If he said Howard didn't do it, then he didn't. "Maybe some teenage boy," I offered. "That'd be about the right size," said Marty. We came to a hollow between 2 hillsides where a little stream ran. There were strange markings carved into the trees. Bits of rags hung in the branches. Animal skulls were placed at certain strategic locations. "What a weird place," said Marty. The place was eerie in a way I can't adequately put into words. We decided then we should turn back to the cottage. When we arrived, Janet was nowhere to be found. Surely a brief shopping trip to the village couldn't have taken this long. It was then that Howard entered the cottage with a basket of fruit. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said. "Howard, have you seen Janet?" Howard wore a concerned expression on his face. "You left her here alone?" he asked. "She went into town," said Marty. A look of alarm spread across Howard's features, such as I'd only seen on the face of shell shock victims. "What in the world has you so spooked, Howard?" exclaimed my Marty. Howard heaved a heavy sigh and sat down in the old rocking chair. "I suppose I can't hide it from you much longer. Back in 1861, Crooked Horn went through a run of bad luck. First there were the locusts, and then came the blight. Then the Yankees came and burned the crops and pastures. The town was on the verge of total starvation. Then an old farmer named Jonah O'Toole started dabbling in black magic. His grandmother had been a witch back in Ireland, and some of her knowledge had been passed to him. He conjured a familiar spirit that he contracted to protect the town. They call him the Corn Man." My mind reeled. Witchcraft, familiars. This didn't belong in an age of science and reason. But modern man is not so far removed from his primal ancestors as he would like to think, and there are still things in this universe that science cannot adequately explain. Howard continued his story. Things got better. The crops improved. The animals stayed healthy. There were no more plagues. But once the minister at the church caught wind of it, he wanted to have O'Toole thrown out of town, but O'Toole used his powers against him. He was the first victim of the straw men. "Straw men?" asked Marty. "The straw men are living scarecrows, the minions of the Corn Man. They do his bidding and the bidding of the witch of the town. Right now that's Morrigan O'Toole, old Buggard's granddaughter." After that, no one dared cross Jonah O'Toole, or old Buggard as he came to be known. That minister was Hezekiah McCormack, your great-grandfather. "What does this have to do with Janet?" I asked. "Where is my wife?" Howard continued. "The Corn Man exacted a terrible price for his services. Every 10 years the citizens of Crooked Horn must perform a blood sacrifice. The victim must be a person with green eyes." I stared in horror as I thought of Janet's flashing emerald irises. "This is crazy," said Marty. "It's all true. Every word," said Howard. "Then what do we do?" I demanded. "We interrupt that party," said Howard. The fire roared brightly, illuminating the otherwise dark night. The band played lively dancing tunes on fiddle, banjo and washboard. All the townsfolk had gathered to celebrate the harvest. All of them were wearing elaborate masks and costumery. It resembled one of those medieval paintings depicting demons in hell. Marty and I entered the revelry. We had pistols concealed in our jackets should it come to violence. We hoped it wouldn't. We split up, looking through the crowd, calling Janet's name. I grabbed one of the revelers by the arm. Something was wrong. It felt too soft. The creature looked at me with button eyes. I tried to pull the mask off, but there was nothing underneath. I held in my hand the creature's head, a sack full of straw. The headless thing just stood there. I dropped the head. The thing leaned down, picked its head up and placed it back atop its torso. To my horror, I realized that a large number of the revelers were not human at all. I staggered back, shocked. I heard Marty's voice calling my name over the music and pressed through the throng toward it. There he stood near the center of the jubilant party, staring in astonishment. There was Janet, wearing a white dress and dancing among the masquerade, if one could call it dancing. She staggered back and forth in a drunken fashion. Clearly they'd intoxicated her somehow. I lurched forward and took her gently by the arm. "Peter," she said, eyes lighting up. "Am I glad to see you?" She tapped me on the nose with her finger. "We need to get you back to the cottage," I said. "Why?" "Janet, you're drunk," I replied brusquely. "Oh, Peter, don't be such a fuddy-duddy. Have some punch. Enjoy yourself." "Janet, we've got to go," I shouted. The music stopped. The partiers turned to face us and closed in about us in a tightening circle. The witch, Morrigan O'Toole, came to the forefront. Marty drew his pistol. "Stay back," he commanded. The mortals obeyed. I took Janet around the waist, picked her up, and carried her toward where we'd parked the car, Marty leading the way. The straw men blocked our way. They each were armed with sickles, pitchforks, and other farming implements. They marched toward us slowly. Marty fired his pistol, hitting one in the chest. Nothing happened. He fired again and again. To his horror, he realized that you can't kill something that was never really alive. Leaving without saying goodbye, that ain't gentlemanlike. I spun around at the sound of the voice. There stood Morrigan O'Toole, grinning wildly at us as the straw men closed in. A shot rang out, and one of the straw men fell. Just on the edge of a nearby cornfield stood Howard, a shotgun in his hand. He fired again, and another straw man fell to earth. I found out later that the shells were filled with rock salt, which is detrimental to evil spirits. The straw men distracted, we raced to the car. I loaded the inebriated Janet into the back seat. I looked out the window to see the gruesome circle tightening around us as straw men and masked townsfolk gathered. Marty was nowhere to be found. Howard could only do so much against so many. We couldn't get out. I thought this was the end. Then Marty came running in, a firebrand in his hand. He threw it at the straw men, setting them ablaze. Howard had evidently followed Marty's lead, setting fire to the ranks of the evil beings. The witch screamed. Marty jumped into the passenger's side. I floored the gas, and we drove out as fast as we could. 2 days later, I found out that the fire we'd started ravaged Crooked Horn, leaving little left to salvage. The witch, Morrigan O'Toole, had apparently died in the fire, and with her, the terrible reign of the Corn Man had ended. The cottage was still intact. I wish the place had burned down too. I have no desire to return there. Story 2. The rain started as a whisper, soft droplets against the pavement, gentle tapping on window panes. It slid down the marble columns of the Lancaster estate, tracing thin veins of water over the stone, as if the house itself were bleeding. The air was thick with petrichor, the earthy scent of damp soil mixing with the ghostly perfume of jasmine from the overgrown trellis near the entrance. The sound of the rain was a symphony. Each drop was a note in a haunting melody. I stood in the doorway, the dim light from the crystal chandelier behind me casting my long shadow across the polished floor. My hands rested at my sides, fingers twitching as if longing to close around something solid. There she was, past the wrought iron gate, the empty street, and the veil of shifting mist. The woman. She hadn't moved in over an hour. The street lamp's sickly glow barely touched her figure, making her less a person and more a presence, a smear of darkness against the silver rain. A too-still silhouette, head tilted slightly, hair damp and clinging to her face like seaweed. Her dress, though soaked through, didn't shiver in the wind. The rain should have driven her away by now, made her step back, retreat, turn, but she stood like a statue left out in the storm, untouched by the cold. Her eyes, a piercing shade of blue, seemed to hold a secret. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogging in the night air. A drop of water slid from my temple to my jaw, tracing a path like a fingertip, slow and deliberate. My heartbeat drummed a quiet rhythm beneath my ribs. She was watching me. The space between us crackled with tension, like a held breath, stretched taut, waiting to snap. The wind carried the faint creak of the gate as it swayed, as if something had nudged it to open an inch. I should turn away. I should close the door. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The suspense was palpable, hanging in the air like the heavy scent of jasmine. And 3 months earlier, the funeral was as it should have been, quiet, respectful, and filled with the appropriate sorrow. A sea of black-clad mourners huddled beneath a sky heavy with unshed rain, their hushed whispers blending with the wind and their murmured condolences dissolving into the damp air. The scent of fresh earth and dying flowers clung to the cemetery, a cloying mix of life and decay. I stood beside Rosa's parents, my posture perfectly composed, my hands cold despite the warm breeze that drifted through the headstones. The wind carried the distant chime of church bells, a sound that should have been comforting but instead felt like a warning, hollow and stretched too thin. Rosa's mother clung to me, her grip trembling, the sharp edges of her nails pressing into the sleeve of my tailored suit. The silk barely shielded me from the pressure, and I wondered absently if she realized how tightly she was holding on, as if I were the last thread tying her daughter's memory to the world. "She loved you so much," she whispered, her voice fragile, her breath warm against my shoulder. She always talked about how lucky she was. I let my arms wrap around her, my grip firm but distant, offering comfort in the way one might comfort a stranger. My voice was smooth and practiced. I was the lucky one. The words sat heavy on my tongue, yet weightless in my chest. After the service, my boss pulled me aside, speaking in the hushed, measured tone people reserved for grief they did not fully understand. "Take all the time you need," he said. "A loss like this, I can't imagine. We'll hold things down at the office." I nodded, thanked him, and allowed myself to be led away. I had learned my role well, the grieving husband, the shattered man. But grief did not settle in my bones the way it should have. It did not wrap around my chest like a vice, and did not steal my lungs' breath. The days that followed blurred into routine. Once filled with soft laughter and the scent of jasmine tea, the house was now an echo chamber of silence. The bed felt too large, the sheets too smooth, and the bed was untouched on one side. The absence was loud in ways I had never anticipated. The refrigerator's hum at night, the absence of her toothbrush beside mine, the ghost of her perfume in the closet, clinging to clothes she would never wear again. My attempts to find solace in my routine only highlighted the void left by her absence. I returned to work, slipping into meetings with robotic precision. My colleagues watched me from the corners of their eyes, their whispers thick with assumptions. My struggle to connect with others was palpable, and my isolation was a heavy shroud. Tennis became an escape, something physical, something that burned. The slam of the ball against the court, the sting of exertion in my muscles. I played too hard, my swings reckless, and the force behind each hit made the others exchange wary glances. "You okay?" one of them asked after I missed an easy return, standing frozen at the net, my grip tightening around the handle of my racket. I forced a smile. "Just tired." They didn't believe me. 3 months later. It had been exactly 3 months since Rosa's funeral. It was also her birthday. The sky was the color of slate, heavy and bruised with approaching rain. The first droplets streaked against the windshield as I drove home, the rhythmic hiss of the wipers cutting through the silence. The city blurred past in smears of neon and shadow, the rain distorting the world into something unreal, something shifting. Then I saw her. She stood on the sidewalk near my building, her frame half illuminated by a flickering street lamp. A woman, barefoot, half naked, her soaked dress clinging to her like a second skin. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes over her face, strands plastered against her pale cheek. My hands clenched around the wheel, fingers pressing deep into the worn leather. The rain ran down her body in thin rivulets, but something darker streaked her skin. Mud? Blood? The water pooled at her feet carried swirls of something deep red, vanishing into the gutter. My foot hesitated on the accelerator. The headlights cast her in stark relief. The sharp planes of her face, the unnatural stillness of her posture, the way her shoulders trembled, but her gaze did not falter. It was as if time had frozen, and I was trapped in this eerie moment. She was looking at me, My chest tightened, breath catching somewhere between my ribs. "Just drive past, don't stop." I swallowed, forced my foot down, and the car lurched forward. The engine's low hum filled the space around me, but it did nothing to drown out the nagging pulse at the back of my mind. My inner turmoil was a storm raging within me, threatening to consume me. Check the mirror. My eyes flicked upward. She hadn't moved. The rain distorted everything, turning streetlights into watery halos and reflections into shifting phantoms. But she was still there, standing in the same spot, watching. My throat felt dry, my pulse hammering too fast against my skin. I exhaled sharply, rolling my shoulders, forcing myself to let go of the tension gripping my spine. A trick of the rain, an exhausted mind conjuring ghosts where none existed. I repeated this mantra, trying to convince myself, but the disbelief in my own words was palpable. I told myself that all the way home. As the storm drummed against my windows and thunder rattled the glass that night, I dreamt of her, and the next time it rained, she was there again. My colleagues noticed at work. During lunch meetings, I barely touched my food, stirring it absently, my gaze vacant as though listening to something only I could hear. My coffee sat untouched, growing cold. On the tennis court, I flinched when the first drops of rain hit the ground, my grip tightening around the racket like a lifeline. I missed easy shots. My movements were sluggish, my reaction time dull, as if something invisible weighed me down. Conversations trailed off when I entered the room. Stares lingered too long. They thought I didn't notice, but I did. The way my co-workers watched me from the corners of their eyes, whispering in hushed tones, their concern curdling into unease. One afternoon, my boss pulled me aside, his voice laced with careful hesitation. "Sam, are you all right?" There was a measured pause. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, a short hollow sound that scraped against my throat. "Just haven't been sleeping well." A lie, a thin, brittle thing. No one believed me. And then, on the 7th night of rain, I saw her again. Not a faceless, blood-streaked spectre. Her, Rosa. She stood beneath the street lamp, motionless, the downpour slicking her hair to her skin. Her dress, the same one from our last night together, clung to her like the tide that had swallowed her whole. Satin, deep blue, heavy with rain, darkened at the hem with something thicker than water. My breath turned to ice in my lungs. Her dark hair fell in familiar waves over her shoulders, curling like the foam of breaking waves. Her lips trembled just slightly, but her eyes, God, her eyes, were locked onto me with a weight that crushed the air from my chest. Lightning slashed across the sky. In that brief, stuttering flash of light, I saw her fully. The pallor of her skin, the sheen of water clinging to her, and the deep red staining the hem of her dress, blooming outward like ink in water. And then she screamed. The sound ripped through the night, a jagged, guttural wail that shattered something inside me. It wasn't just in my ears, inside my skull, bones, and myself. A raw, piercing shriek clawed at my mind, peeling me open and unraveling me like thread stripped from the edge of a frayed rope. I collapsed, knees hitting the pavement, hands clamping over my ears. Stop, stop, stop. But the scream didn't stop. It wouldn't stop, because it wasn't just a scream. It was rage. It was pain. It was vengeance. It drowned me, dragged me under like the waves had dragged her, and in that suffocating abyss, a memory surfaced, sharp, inescapable. Not an accident, not a misstep. I had killed her. The wineglass trembled in my grip. The slow swirl of the drug dissolved, invisible, into a deep red. Her laughter had softened and slurred. Her eyelids had fluttered, her body leaning into me with blind trust. How I had lifted her, effortlessly, over the yacht's railing. Her body had hit the water like a whisper, silent, vanishing into the dark. I had watched the bubbles rise, population vanish. I had waited, waited, waited. She never came back up. And yet now, here she was. The hospital was quiet, save for the rain tapping against the barred windows, a ceaseless rhythmic whisper against the glass. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, casting a cold, sterile glow over the pale walls. The air smelled of antiseptic and damp linen, the scent settling heavy in my lungs like a weight I could never quite exhale. I sat hunched on the stiff mattress, hands tangled in my greying hair, my fingers pressing into my scalp as if trying to dig something out. A memory, a voice, a nightmare that refused to die. The orderlies moved past my door in shuffling patterns, their voices distant, their presence insignificant. I barely noticed them anymore. They came, they went. They pushed little white pills into my palm and watched to ensure I swallowed. It didn't matter. The pills did nothing. Nothing could stop her. A flash of lightning split the sky. I turned my head toward the window, my breath already shallow, my muscles locking tight. I knew what I would see. I always did. She was there. Standing just beyond the bars, the pale, flickering light haloed her body. Her soaked dress clung to her frame, the dark, heavy fabric dripping onto the windowsill. Her bare feet hovered above the rain-slicked pavement outside, toes barely grazing the surface. They were not touching, never touching. Her hair, once soft waves that tumbled over her shoulders, now hung in tangled rope strands sticking to the sunken hollows of her face. Her skin, pallid and waterlogged, stretched too tight over her cheekbones. Her lips, blue, trembling, parted slightly, but no breath escaped. Her appearance was a grotesque mockery of the woman I once knew. She stared. My pulse thudded against my ribs. My stomach turned, but I couldn't move. I never could. Her arm rose, slow and deliberate, droplets sliding from her fingertips, a single shaking finger extended, pointing directly at me, accusing, unrelenting. Then, the scream. The room shattered with sound. Not just a noise, not just a voice, a force. A jagged, piercing wail rattled the glass, made the walls tremble, and tore through me. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The scream wasn't just in the air. It was inside me. It flooded my veins and scraped at the marrow of my bones. It filled every corner of the room and every cell of my body, vibrating, suffocating, and drowning. I slammed myself against the wall, gasping, clawing at my arms, trying to rip something out, something buried beneath my skin. My own sobs broke through, raw and animalistic, but the scream only grew louder, pressing against my skull like a storm waiting to burst. My futile escape attempts only served to highlight my desperation. No one came to help me. No one ever did. The hospital's silence, the absence of any comforting presence, only deepened my isolation. The rain poured outside, heavy, relentless, a drumbeat to my unraveling. She did not leave. She never would. Story 3. The hair on the back of my neck stood up moments before a crackling arc of green light struck the nearby streetlight. I swerved the car to the right, my instinct for preservation taking control. Jerking the steering wheel back to the left, I heard the groan of the wheels as they spun clods of dirt over the nearby fence bordering a field of corn days away from harvest. Teresa screamed from the back of the car, flinging herself over Matthew, secure in his car seat. The car bumped awkwardly back onto the tarmac before finally steadying itself. When I was sure we weren't about to pop a tire, I glanced back at my wife and son. "Everyone okay back there?" "Jesus, Gareth, what the hell?" yelled Teresa. "You almost landed us in a ditch." Before I could respond, a monstrous clap of thunder erupted behind us, lifting the back of the car slightly off the ground. I gripped the wheel tightly as we bounced back down, breathing out slowly as we continued moving. Matthew took that moment to wake up, jerking forward, only to be restrained by his car seat straps. He started crying, sensing the fraught emotions in the car. "I'm sorry," I yelled. "I doubt you could have done any better." She ignored me, focusing on trying to calm Matthew down. I sighed as I leaned forward to look out the window, wondering where the next strike might come from. Black clouds roiled in the sky above us, reaching clawing hands from across the ocean to our right over the fields. Forks of green lightning spread out from a single point, which reminded me of a demonic face. Damn it! I knew taking the coastal road this time of year wasn't a good idea, but once again we had to do things your way. I softened my tone suddenly, realizing I was just making things worse. "I'm sorry. That was uncalled for. Would you mind checking the map back there? There must be a motel or something close by where we can wait this out." "Give me a second. Your child is having a bit of a meltdown." "Sure, he's my child when he's acting out." I shook my head as I continued driving. Matthew finally calmed down after Teresa put his sticker book in front of him. I heard her pulling out the map when the first drops of rain hit the windshield and the trees in the distance started to sway. "We just passed mile marker 63, I said, trying to hurry her up. After a minute, I heard her slam her finger down. "I found it, and then we just need to take the next turn off about a mile down the road. There's some place called Cobb's Landing close to Helsing Cove. They must have a motel or B&B or something for us to stay in." I nodded, focusing on finding the turn-off in the waning evening light. "Did you hear what I said, Gareth?" Teresa asked. "A response would be nice." "I heard you. I was just trying to concentrate on not getting us killed again." "Next time say something. I'm not a mind reader." "Oh, I'm aware. Do you think we could have a bit of silence while I get us to safety?" She didn't respond, and I sighed. After a few minutes, I saw the turn-off and took it, sweat forming on my brow as I drove directly into the incoming rain. "The storm's definitely coming in from the ocean. Maybe we should head the other way." I was trying to keep my nerves together, but even I could hear the tremor in my voice. "There's nothing closer for miles. If we turn around now, we'll just get caught in the middle of it." Teresa jumped as another strike flashed behind us. "Just go faster, okay?" We pulled into town about 10 minutes later. The streetlights had already been turned on, but the now steadily pouring rain was still making visibility difficult. I tried to make out the signs above the buildings, but wasn't having much luck. "Can you see anything out there?" Teresa unstrapped her seatbelt and leaned over Matthew, who was now being kept busy with a banana, and tried to peer out the window. "Not in this. Where are we anyway?" "I'm not sure. This kind of looks like a main road. Maybe they'll have a gas station or..." "Whoa!" I slammed on the brakes. I heard Teresa's body slam against the passenger seat, followed by a grunt. "Are you insane?" she shouted, rubbing her shoulder as she checked on Matthew. "I'm sorry. There was something in the road. It looked like... I'm not sure. A shadow or something. It doesn't matter. Are you and Matty all right?" "He's fine. He just bumped his head on my stomach. My shoulder, on the other hand..." "Oh, Gareth, look outside." "What is it?" "There's some flashing lights saying diner." I leaned over and glanced up. "Huh, would you look at that? Well, if nothing else, we can at least get some dinner and maybe a coffee. Then we can ask directions to the nearest hotel or whatever they have in this place." Teresa let out a small laugh. I was getting a bit worried there. That lightning strike really rattled me. I've never seen anything like it. I did once, at my uncle's ranch, split a tree down the middle. We were lucky the barn and house were untouched. I backed up a bit, curious at the complete lack of traffic, and parked in the space in front of the diner. Opening an umbrella, I held it out for Teresa and Matthew as we hurried inside. The rain had become a torrent. At the back of my mind, I knew there was the possibility of a flash flood, but I never said anything as I beamed at the matron behind the counter. "Quite the storm," I said by way of greeting. Glad we made it inside. The elderly woman wore a black apron with the name of the diner swirling in white cursive across the front. The landing pad, I said. Clever. The woman stared at us a moment, her face paling in the neon lights strewn about the interior. Oh my, we weren't expecting any outsiders today. Please, it's best you get back in your car and head back the way you came. Excuse me, butted in Teresa. Have you looked outside? We were almost struck by lightning getting here. I am not taking my son back out into that. I held up my hands, trying to lighten the mood. I get it. You're a small town. Probably don't get too many strangers. Maybe we can just eat a quick dinner, then you can point us in the direction of a place to stay for the night. We'll leave come morning, I swear. The woman glanced to her right, and it was only then that I realized most of the booths were full up and everyone was staring at us. We're a bit packed tonight, as you can see, and her voice descended into an inaudible whisper as she stared at me, or rather at my neck. Where did you get that? She asked, her voice trembling. Get what? What is it? I touched my neck. It felt wet, probably from the rain, but it was more than that. It also felt slick, like it was covered in a layer of oil. Gareth, what the hell is that? Asked Teresa, leaning over. I honestly have no idea what either of you is talking about. What does it look like? Like a rash. But, well, it's shaped like a coiled snake. I smirked. A snake? Seriously? I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. I'll find a pharmacy in the morning and get some ointment. It's probably just hives caused by anxiety. That is no rash, said the old woman, her voice going cold. It's his mark. The last part she said loud enough for the whole diner to hear. A man stood up suddenly, a pistol dangling at his side. I tensed, prepared to leap in front of Matthew, only to let out a sigh when I saw the glint of a badge. Everything all right here, Gladys? He asked, walking over. He had a full dark beard that reminded me of the lumberjacks who worked for my father, with a deep voice to match. You tell me, Sheriff, we got strangers. They have no business being here today, but... She glanced over at me. He nodded at her, smiling broadly. Nonsense, Gladys. We're the welcoming sort, are we not? Come, please join me at my table. Dinner's on me tonight. Matron, how about some steaks, medium rare, and for the little Juan, some grilled fish, a treat for him, I'm sure. He beamed a smile at Teresa, who returned it tepidly. I'm sure he'll love it, she said. Wonderful, and coffee all round. We'll be needing to stay awake tonight, won't we? He laughed, glancing over his shoulder at the other patrons. Some of them clapped their hands on their tables, but most didn't respond. I looked at their faces and licked my lips. I turned to say something to Teresa, but the sheriff was already guiding her to his table. Please, take a seat. And what should I be calling this little man? This is Matthew, she said, a bit unsure. I'm Teresa, and this is my husband, Gareth. She inched her way into the booth and over to the window, holding Matthew as he fussed. Say hello to the nice man, I said as I joined her. Hello, he said. My name's Matthew. What's yours? Why, hello there, Matthew. That's quite polite for someone your age. 4, are you? I'm 3. Even more so, he said. I go by Sheriff Green around here. Nice to make your acquaintance. So where do you folks hail from? City slickers, are you? Actually, no, I said. We come from Barnett's Haven, a small town southwest of here. We were just traveling up the coast to my mother's place for a short visit when we got waylaid. Barnett's Haven, is it? Can't say it rings a bell, but I've never been good with geography. Why aren't you more concerned about this storm, Sheriff Green? Asked Teresa, clearly not up for pleasantries. Surely you should be on patrol or something. He turned slowly to look at her while scratching his nose. Any other storm you might be right, but not this one. You see, me and the other townsfolk have some other obligations we have to take care of tonight. Oh? Now don't you worry yourself about that. Gladys took that moment to put a plate of fish down in front of us. Coffee'll be up in a moment, Steaks need a few more minutes. She threw the sheriff a nasty glare before turning away. "Come now, eat up," said the sheriff, handing her some cutlery from the end of the table. "We can't have you telling others that Cobb's Landing wasn't hospitable." I glanced at Teresa. "We might as well eat. Do you want me to hold Matthew?" "No," she said a little sharply. "He's fine where he is. Come, Matthew, have some rice while I check the fish for bones." "What about his water?" "Damn it, I left his bottle in the car. Do you think you can get it?" "You want me to go out in that?" I asked, pointing through the window. "It'll just take a sec. The car's right there and you have the umbrella." "Fine. Excuse me, Sheriff. Do you mind if I move past you?" Sheriff Green didn't move. "I'm sure Gladys can bring some water for the boy. I wouldn't want you to get wet now." "That's all right. You know, when the wife insists, how can you say no?" He sat motionless for what seemed an eternity. He dropped the smile. "I wouldn't want you to miss out on the steak." I frowned. Why would I miss out? Sheriff Green scratched his beard, then stepped out of the booth. "As you wish. But I wouldn't be much of a sheriff if I didn't at least accompany you out into this deluge. I'll even hold the umbrella." "That's kind of you. See, honey, just a bunch of friendly people. I wouldn't have you thinking otherwise." Teresa sat in silence, watching as the two of us walked up to the doors. She jumped when Gladys put the coffee mugs on the table. "Where's your husband and the sheriff?" she asked, her tone now one of concern. "Oh, they just stepped out quickly to get Matthew's water bottle. Oh, sweetie." She leaned in close to her ear, whispering rapidly. "Now you need to listen to me. There's an exit out the back of the diner. I don't know how far you'll get in this storm, but it's the only option you have. Your husband's fate has been sealed, but you can still make it out." She stood back upright, speaking to the room. "The lady just needs to use the restroom. I'm sure we can oblige her." Teresa froze. She looked back out to where we were, but we were nowhere to be seen. She stood up, Matthew in her arms, but a few of the other burlier townsfolk moved to block her way. "No, matron," one of them said. "She stays. Her husband's marked. She must bear witness." Gladys looked about to argue, but clearly thought against it. "I'm sorry, hun. I really am." A sudden quiet descended on the diner as the rain stopped. Gladys looked outside. "We're in the eye of the storm. It's time." She reached for Matthew and yanked him out of her arms, handing his struggling body over to another woman who had come up from behind her. Teresa screamed, scrambling to reach her son, when a large hand grabbed the back of her head and slammed her head down onto the table. I sucked in breath, my head pounding as I opened my eyes. Firelight danced in front of me, and I threw up, sick dripping off my chin down onto my chest. Breathing hard, I tried to move, only to find that my hands and feet were tied firmly to a wooden post attached firmly to a pier jutting out into the sea. Waves crashed all around me, and green lightning periodically lit up the sky, but inside all that rage was an eerie silence. The sun had set a while back, the only light coming from torches reaching all the way back to the beach. 2 more posts stood next to mine, but I didn't recognize either of the naked men tied to them. "Hey!" I shouted at them, hearing the panic in my own voice. "What's going on?" "He's marked us for sacrifice," one of them said, his voice radiating with nervous excitement. "Sacrifice? Are you serious? Sacrifice to what?" But neither of them answered. I tried pulling on the ropes again, but it was no use. I slumped forward, realizing then that I too had been stripped of my clothes. I heard a shout from the beach, and I glanced up, watching as a figure stumbled out of the dark toward us. "Teresa! Teresa! Oh, thank God you're okay. Where's Matthew? What have they done with him?" "Gareth!" she shouted as she reached me. "Oh, Gareth, I'm so sorry. The way I treated you. We should never have come here. I've just been—" "It's okay, Teresa. Can you find something to cut the rope?" She stilled as she took my face in her hands. "It's too late for that. They said I could say goodbye. They're holding Matthew on the beach. He's fine, though. They promised not to hurt him. That's when I noticed the bruise forming on her forehead. They hurt you? Those bastards. I'll kill them for this. It's too late to do anything. I'm sorry. They said it'll probably be quick. I don't know. She let go, her eyes slipping down to my neck. I grit my teeth as the rash flared to life with a light that mirrored the lightning above, burning deep. I'm sorry. I have to go. I love you. Matthew loves you. She stumbled back, then turned and ran. Teresa? Teresa? No, don't leave me, please. I leaned forward, willing the post to break, but it didn't budge. I breathed out slowly, mist forming in front of my face. I froze, unable to move. Green light enveloped me and I sighed in relief as the pain dissipated. Soon, I felt nothing at all. Matthew leaned over to kiss his mom. She lay in bed, staring up blankly at the ceiling. I finally found them, he whispered, and I'm going to put a stop to it. He leaned back, took a knife out from his belt, and made a small cut in the palm of her hand. Father Jacob says it can only be banished using the blood of a witness. We were both there that night, but I was too young to remember. But you do. You remember it all, don't you? That's why. He wiped away a tear and pressed his finger into the blood. He turned and walked over to the nearby mirror, staring at the sigil carved into his chest. Gritting his teeth, he traced it with his bloodied finger, ignoring the burning sensation that washed through him. When he was finished, he got dressed. Goodbye, Mum. Be comforted that your son is going to do right by our family. He left, notifying the ward nurse that his mother needed bandaging. Stepping out of the building before they could question him, he got into his car and drove north, green lightning beckoning him on. Story 4. The rain lashed against the lab windows like God was tapping along to a Neil Peart drum solo. I gritted my teeth, my mop of a fringe plastered to my forehead by the sweat. I needed to hurry up. The storm would soon be upon me. I was so close, and if I didn't have the creature ready in the next few minutes, I'd have to wait until the next storm. And who knew when that would be? No, it had to be now. It could not wait. Lightning flashed on the horizon. 15 seconds later, the thunder rumbled distant. The rain became heavier, striking the panes in sheets. If only I still had Igor, there wouldn't be any stress. But my faithful servant had left me up the proverbial creek without a rowing tool, the ingrate. So now I had to manage everything myself. Igor should be doing the grunt work whilst I busied myself with brilliant science. Now I had to contend with stitching the creature and raising the platform myself. If only Igor hadn't gotten so greedy and demanded more money and better treatment. It wasn't that I couldn't afford it. I was rich enough to chase these scientific dreams that earned no money without fear of poverty. But it was the sheer principle of it all. Why did nobody want to work anymore? I tutted, armed the sweat out of my eyes, and continued stitching like a madman. Throughout the lab, strobing electrical devices crackled and arced blue sparks. Test tubes and bottles bubbled with neon liquids, green and purple. Now and then, the lab lights dimmed when the wind whipped against the building. My top lip held beads of perspiration. My tongue stuck out the corner of my mouth, and my brow furrowed in concentration. All that focusing on bottling lightning had burned my retinas, damaging my eyesight. Was this why Igor had requested goggles, citing PPE laws and claiming workers' rights? Bah, what nonsense. A real scientist handled reagents ungloved and pipetted with his mouth. It was about time that Igor understood how the world worked. With a final burst of focus, I stitched the last stitch and tied the end off. I let out my breath and stood back to survey my handiwork, using my fingers to frame the scene. The creature lay on the platform, strapped down by the wrists and ankles. A bolt stuck out of each side of its neck, ready to receive the spark of life from the heavens. Its patchwork skin ranged from funeral drum grey to putrescent green. The stitches adorning its body were wobbly, going from too close together to too far apart. The thread also had a few colors because I hadn't purchased the new spools Igor had requested. I claimed the departmental budget didn't allow it. I had to rummage in my junk drawers for string scraps to sew the creature. It was shoddy work, but I had done it in half the time Igor would have taken. Why did it take him so long to do this basic stuff? Whatever, it didn't matter. The creature was ready and the storm was here. It was time to take my place as the most outstanding scientist ever and give life to the inanimate. I pulled 2 cables from the lightning conductor at the head of the platform. I snapped each one onto the creature's neck bolts using their crocodile clips. Grinning, I patted the creature's barrel-shaped chest. Not long, my friend, soon. The lift involved thick ropes and pulleys intertwined around axles, shafts, and wheels. My eyebrow rose, and I tapped my chin with a finger. The lift system had been Igor's baby, like my creature. Before Igor quit, I should have asked for a training session or a how-to guide. But how could I, the world's most brilliant mind, ask my underling to teach me? The idea was preposterous. I could figure this out. I traced the cables with my eyes. I untied the bottom rope and gave it a cursory tug. The platform groaned and shifted. I nodded and pulled a so-so face. Seemed simple enough. Lightning exploded in the bloated black firmament. A few seconds later, thunder boomed. The lights went completely out and flickered back to life a moment later. My heart thumped in my chest, as if someone had hooked me up to that great battery in the sky. I felt alive for the first time in my existence. It was now or never. I took the rope in both hands and pulled. The platform lifted an inch. I gasped. Good God, it was heavy. No wonder Igor had such thick arms, heaving this thing up and down all day and night. I, a lab-dwelling nerd if there ever was one, had never been one for physical labor. I preferred instead to exercise my mind. I wrapped the rope around my hands, locked my legs into an A pose and heaved. The platform shuddered and rose in fits and starts. It swung from side to side as my uneven, unpracticed pulls jerked it back and forth. Veins popped out on my temples and my gums throbbed from clenching my teeth so tight. It was a good job I'd strapped the bugger down, otherwise the poor chap would have rolled off the edge like a sibling who claimed the top bunk. I gasped, and I wheezed, and I pulled, and I pulled. The roof opened as the platform reached the ceiling, sliding apart to offer a slice of the sky. Rain gushed through, cascading over the platform and pattering on the grimy linoleum. Cold air snaked inside, snatching up papers and scattering them. Goosebumps prickled up all over my skin, and it wasn't only because of the chill. The strength in my arms waned, and I yanked harder, thankful for the breeze drying the sweat on my skin. The platform rose, plugging the roof until the rain trickled through in only dribs and drabs. With shaking, 2 weak hands, I fell on the pulley and wrapped the rope around, tying it off. I held onto it for a moment longer, not trusting it. I let go and leapt backward. But the pulley system held, and the platform remained. I laughed at my strength, as well as my ingenuity. I was pretty brilliant, wasn't I? I leaned against the pulley's central column for a breath to wait until the feeling came back into my limbs. Once I could stand without collapsing like a sheet after the ghost had fled, I set to my destiny. Brilliant science. I ran around, giggling, flipping switches, pulling levers, hitting buttons, turning dials. And then, at last, I slapped the big red button. The lights went out for good. I stood in the dark, my chest rising and falling, my breaths filling the silence. I waited. Lightning zapped a rain-drenched tree in the garden. Thunder boomed. I waited. Another brilliant flash. The thunder was a second away. I waited, tongue dangling from my mouth, fingers dancing over the button's surface. Lightning struck. I hit the button. The strobing devices flared blue, bathing the lab in electricity. Ozone plumed into the atmosphere. The light bulbs exploded as the power surged into them. The machinery awoke, growing from a bowel rumbling growl to a supersonic whine. Sparks danced across the floor, kissing the puddles where the rainwater pooled. and up on the roof, something flared brighter than the sun. I cackled, "Live, my child, live." Overhead, lightning flashed once more. It boomed a little softer as the storm lumbered past like a bear who'd decided it could find better food elsewhere. I struggled for air as the whole world around me held its breath. Hands quaking, I untied the rope and steadied myself against the platform's weight. I let it slip through my fingers, inches at a time, whining under the strain. The platform wobbled down from its place in the ceiling. Rainwater trickled through the gap, but with less urgency than before. Struggling to hold onto the rope, I wheezed. I squinted up at the platform. The platform jerked as it descended due to my poor technique. But that wasn't the only reason. Something up there was squirming, trying to wriggle free. A grotesque green-hued hand burst free from its restraints. Broken bits of leather and metal linkage tinkled to the floor. The creature's fist stood in stark relief against the backdrop of night, clenched in defiance of God. Unfettered joy bloomed across my face. For a moment I forgot all my worldly aches and pains. "It's Allah!" Sudden lightning flashed. A last goodbye from the departing storm. I yelped and flinched and let go of the rope. The pulley system whirred to life without any resistance to hold it back. The ropes flew like break-dancing snakes, letting gravity finally have its say. The platform plummeted while the creature growled its inarticulate grievances with the world. I tried to catch the rope but squealed and flew backward as the hissing cord burned my hands. The platform crashed to the lab floor, shattering into pieces. The coil-shaped conductor exploded, shards of still-sparking material spraying around the room. The shrapnel shattered glassware, sending sprays of colored liquid splattering. The restraints popped open. The creature's stitches snapped, unable to hold back the forces of physics. The creature burst open like a piñata filled with organs. The heart spurted free from the chest cavity, a fish through an amateur fisherman's hands. The brain shot out of the skull, slapped into the wall, rolled down, and splattered into a gooey heap on the floor. Guts and entrails sprayed out like confetti and streamers at a New Year's Eve bash for zombies. Tears streamed down my cheeks, mixing with the droplets of sweat. My mouth turned upside down in a comical display of grief. "No, no, no!" The creature's lungs whizzed around the room, blowing a raspberry at me. I watched them as they crashed into the windows like a blind bird. The sacks plopped to the floor, farted a few bloody pockets of air out, and then were still. Grief-stricken, I clung to the pulley's column for support. I realized something, at long last. If you mistreat your workers, you shouldn't feel shocked when things fall apart at the seams without them. Clutching the pillar, I sank to the floor, sobbing.